Good afternoon, everyone. Bon après-midi, tout le monde qui se joignent à nous ici en personne et aussi en ligne. On est très contente que vous soyez des nôtres aujourd'hui. So welcome to the Institute for Science, Society and Policy's fourth Grand Challenge Action Dialogue, which is being undertaken today in collaboration with the Research Chair in Science Diplomacy within the University of Ottawa and the Embassy of France, and with the Center for International Policy Studies. We're delighted to collaborate with impressive organizations to undertake this action dialogue. So the action dialogues that we've undertaken this year, for those of you who have not had an occasion to participate in one of these sessions, it's a broadening and a deepening of an initiative that the ISSP called Confluences. We launched this initiative last year. It takes a strategic and innovative approach to knowledge mobilisation at the intersection of science, society, and policy. Alors, je m'appelle Monica Gheciu, puis pour ceux et celles qui ne me connaissent pas, je suis professeure à l'Université d'Ottawa ainsi que directrice de l'Institut de recherche sur la science, la société et la politique publique. L'événement va avoir lieu en anglais, mais si jamais vous avez des questions, soyez vraiment bienvenus de les poser dans la langue de votre choix. We're going to begin today with the Indigenous affirmation of the University of Ottawa. We pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region, from all nations across Canada, who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. And I really like this ending on past, present, and future, because I think it helps us to remember that we are meeting today at a moment in time that has a long history and will have a long future. So for those who don't know, the Institute for Science, Society and Policy, we're a cross-faculty institute at the University of Ottawa. We explore the links between science, society, and policy. We focus on three core areas: policies for science, technology, and innovation, science for policy, otherwise known as evidence-based or evidence-informed decision-making, and governance of emerging technologies. Our strategic vision is very ambitious. It's to help Canada transform decision-making for the grand challenges of our time. And we do that by using our convening power, as we are here today, bringing together leaders across sectors and also undertaking multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary research at that science, society, policy interface. So now a little bit more about Confluences, Grand Challenge Action Dialogues. You've got here up on the slide, the grand challenges that are facing society, whether it's climate change, pandemics, inequality, insecurity, many challenges. They require solutions at that intersection of science, society, and policy. Cutting edge research is being undertaken in this space, as you're going to hear about today, at the Institute, at the university. And but there's lots of opportunity to really try to better mobilize, foster co-production of knowledge at those interfaces. And so last year, the Institute launched this new initiative called Confluences, which brings together the co-creation of an annual knowledge mobilization series. So you're taking part in that series today, those of you who are in the room and online, as well as an edited volume on science, society, and policy. It's enjoyed a lot of traction with decision makers from across a variety of sectors, as well as with early career researchers and thought leaders from a variety of sectors. So this year, 2024-2025, we decided to broaden and deepen what we were doing with Confluences with the Grand Challenge Action Dialogues. And really the aim of these is to incorporate more direct engagement with seasoned and emerging leaders on grand challenges. So today is our fourth action dialogue. You can see the previous dialogues that we've held over the course of the last number of months. Where possible, we have undertaken these dialogues in collaboration and partnership with other organizations. And so, as I've mentioned to you, we're delighted today to be doing so with the Center for International Policy Studies, uOttawa, Embassy of France, research chair in science diplomacy. So each dialogue consists of a publicly accessible interactive engagement with guest speakers or panels of speakers. So what we're about to do today. And that's followed by a by invitation dialogue, which those of you in the room will be participating in with seasoned and emerging leaders across a variety of sectors to take a deeper dive into the issue with the Chatham House Rule discussion. We've also really made a lot of space and hopefully successfully provided meaningful opportunities for graduate students and early career researchers to participate in the sessions, recognizing that the future is in their hands, not many of us around the room who are of a certain age. I'd like to take a moment, and if you could just go to the next slide, to thank the Confluence's advisory group. I won't go through all of their names here today, but a number of them are in the room or online. This group has been really helpful in terms of identifying where some of the key areas are that we should focus our work. Next slide. This is my final slide before turning things over. So for today's agenda, I'm just finishing up my welcoming remarks, and I'll be turning the floor over to Alexandra Gheciu in one moment. We'll have our presentation from our guest speaker for today, Patrick Fafard. We are delighted to have discussant, the science attaché from the French embassy, Jean-François Doulet, who will provide some comments, and we'll have an open discussion and Q&A session moderated by my colleague and friend, Alexandra Gheciu, the director of the Center for International Policy Studies. Donc, il me fait un grand plaisir de maintenant inviter la professeure Martine Lagacé, the University of Ottawa's Associate Vice President, Research, Promotion and Development, to say a few words about it.
Merci beaucoup Monica. Bonjour à tous. Je suis très heureuse d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui dans le cadre du lancement de cette 4e édition des conférences Confluence organisées par l'Institut de recherche sur la science, la société et la politique publique. Je me permets de féliciter particulièrement la directrice Monica Gattinger. Ce genre d'initiative est un croisement extraordinaire au niveau de la recherche interdisciplinaire, de la mobilisation des connaissances. C'est exactement le rôle des centres instituts de recherche à l'Université d'Ottawa. Today's dialogue, which addresses the major challenges of science, diplomacy, research, and practice in an increasingly fragmented and uncertain geopolitical world, is more relevant than ever. Indeed, as was said before, the world is constantly changing, and as researchers, we have a key role to play. Science diplomacy is an essential lever for this, and conferences such as today's offer a valuable opportunity to raise awareness of the issues, to promote dialogue, strengthen cooperation, and actively contribute to the necessary transformations throughout the world. En fait, la diplomatie scientifique est au cœur du lien entre les percées de la recherche et les politiques étrangères des gouvernements. Ce rapprochement de la recherche scientifique et de la diplomatie permet de fait d'identifier des solutions concrètes aux défis mondiaux et d'accroître la collaboration à l'échelle internationale. Comme le fait remarquer à juste titre le professeur Patrick Fafard, un pays s'engage dans la diplomatie scientifique dans la mesure où un lien direct est établi entre la science et la politique étrangère de son gouvernement. Et d'ailleurs, au cours de cette conférence, le chercheur Patrick Fafard partagera sa vision, ses perspectives sur la diplomatie scientifique, particulièrement sur la pratique de la diplomatie scientifique. Patrick Fafard est professeur à l'École supérieure des affaires publiques et internationales, aussi membre de l'Institut de recherche sur la science, la société et la politique publique. Il est aussi co-titulaire de la chaire de recherche en diplomatie scientifique aux côtés de son collègue, le professeur Pascal Griset de la Sorbonne. C'est une chaire que nous avons créée en 2023 entre l'Université d'Ottawa et l'ambassade de France au Canada. Une chaire donc qui témoigne de l'engagement commun de nos deux institutions et de nos deux nations pour l'excellence en recherche. Much more than an academic partnership, this initiative reflects our desire to explore new scientific horizons. Investing in science diplomacy means building bridges between cultures and knowledge, thus stimulating innovation and progress. Et dans cet esprit d'engagement commun, Nous avons également le privilège aujourd'hui d'accueillir Jean-François Doulet, attaché de coopération scientifique et universitaire à l'ambassade de France au Canada, qui agira à titre de commentateur. So without further ado, let me introduce the moderator of today's discussion, Dr. Alexandra Gheciu, professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs and director of the Center for International Policy Studies. Je vous souhaite une discussion, une réflexion très fructueuse. Merci.
For the great support that you have always provided personally and of course on behalf of the university. Merci aussi à l'ambassade de France. And it is my honor and genuine pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Patrick Fafard, who without further ado will get us started on today's presentation. Welcome everyone. Thank you for being here and I hope you enjoy it. Thanks.
Merci beaucoup tout le monde. Merci Monica, Alexandra pour avoir fait la mise en scène et je vais faire écho de certains des propos négatifs. Alors, un grand merci aussi évidemment à l'ambassade de France au Canada pour avoir fait le partenariat avec l'Université d'Ottawa pour créer la chaire, qui me donne l'occasion de continuer une recherche que je fais sur les liens entre politique publique et sciences depuis bien longtemps. My presentation will be in English, but of course, in the Q&A we can do things in both languages. So, what I'm going to do today is, my presentation is divided into sort of 4 chunks. First, I'll do a bit of ground clearing to give you a sense of where I'm coming from and how I think of both the theory and practice of science diplomacy and the small number of research that has been done so far by scholars on science diplomacy. Second will be the good news story, where I will give a very brief sketch, much more brief than I would like, that situates both the research on and the practice of science diplomacy in a much broader context of very long-standing interest in making effective use of scientific research in policymaking. And then in the third section, which is the bad news story, if you will, there are some fundamental challenges to science and indeed international relations that I think will potentially change or shift what we do in science diplomacy and how we think about it. And finally, I'll try and end on a positive note and give, my crystal ball is no better than anyone else's, as you'll see in a minute. Okay, so definition, perspectives, where am I coming from? As I indicated, for about the last almost, oh my goodness, 20 years, I've been working on the relationship between scientific research and public policy. And it all began when I was asked, Professor Fafard, could you write a paper on why the government doesn't do what the evidence says the government should? Which, for a political scientist, is a rather odd question, and it goes to the heart of the ISSP. But as the ISSP is a willing demonstration of, it is a real question requiring people to come from science. And I wrote a paper which tries to explain that. But I spent the last 20 years trying to think about, well, why would you ask that question in the first place? What brings people trained in science and what conception do they have of the policy process? My domain of expertise is health policy, broadly defined, and public health in particular. So the book on the cover on the slide there is a book that we published a couple of years ago, in which we brought together a series of authors from around the world to both from public health and from political science and from social policy to think through the relationship between science and evidence and making of public policy. And the theme, if you will, is there's a bit of a stalemate. Whereas on the one hand, people in science are frustrated with the fact that the government doesn't do what the evidence says the government should do, whereas people in social science kind of go, wow. But in developing this book, I also developed the concept of a political science with public health. That is to say, a partnership and collaboration as opposed to simply sitting on analytically online, looking down and commenting. So today I'm going to try and give a sketch of political science with science diplomacy, which, if you wish, you could summarize as, hi, I'm from political science and I'm here to help. And I'll let you decide whether it's helpful. Just one other conceptual thing that I'll say right off the top. My research and my time in government make me convinced that there's no such thing as evidence-based policy. And I'll just say that flatly. And we should have a conversation about why we use that term. And second of all, and again, I'll go on a limb here, but I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say, for the longest time, the scientific community writ large has not spent nearly enough time understanding politics, has a somewhat pejorative view of politics. And indeed, why wouldn't they? We live in an era where politics and politicians have become the object of attack. It's a very different world, and so we take into account of it. To organize what I'm about to say, I want to suggest that we can think about science diplomacy using the concept of the demand for science and scientific research and making policy, the supply of said research. And what I'm particularly interested in is the governance of that relationship. How do we match demand and supply? Because at its core, there is almost an unstated assumption that governments seeking to address problems at home and abroad to craft good policy need scientific research and are constantly looking for it. In some cases more, in some cases less. And second, there's an assumption that that scientific research will be untapped. That is, when governments go asking, there'll be somebody there to answer the phone. Now, on that point, however, we also know that governments have the capacity, if the answer is not readily available, to use their fiscal capacity to make it happen. And we saw that during the COVID-19 pandemic. Much of my research, I'll give a minute, was funded because somebody in the government of Canada decided that the governance of pandemics might be almost as important as new vaccines. And I think obviously they're right about that. So this gives rise then to a governance challenge. And just to skip ahead, what I think is important is that both this practice of science diplomacy and the research on science diplomacy, it's very bottom up and it pays almost no attention to this huge amount of activity in research. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. So before I do that though, I think I want to talk a little bit more about demand. And this anticipates sort of the end of my talk, the bad news part of it. Seems to me that my reading, and it may be wrong, is that one of the precursors or necessary but not sufficient conditions for the rise of science diplomacy was that after World War II, the nature of international relations changed. And there was space for the first time in a while to be focused on things other than promoting peace or avoiding war. And we developed a series of multilateral agencies and foreign policy agendas that raised a whole bunch of issues around human rights, ending colonial rule, and the list goes on, some of which required scientific and technological. And some of this was multilateral, some of it was bilateral. So I have a little cartoon there of acid rain. I think a really interesting example, early example, if you will, of bilateral science diplomacy was the acid rain treaty between Canada and the United States, which had the benefit, it happened relatively quickly, it was contested without a doubt, but it was an example of where governments sought to address a problem, tapped the available scientific expertise. Another example from this era might be the Montreal Protocol to limit depletion of the ozone layer, and the regulation of CFCs. So some of what we observe in science diplomacy has been going on for decades. But my second argument is that the end of the Cold War gave rise to a much bigger and broader agenda. So in global health governance, we talk about the glory years of global health governance that, depending on who's doing the thinking, begins sometime in the late 90s, early 2000s, and runs to the middle of the 2010s to say 2015. Enormous amount of activity, creation of new organizations, enormous amounts of money, experimentation with new international organizations. But more broadly, this is an example of what, depending on who's doing the writing, the expansion of, if you will, public diplomacy, science diplomacy with ways is an extension of that. Or if you will, this is all an example of the exercise of soft power. So it seems to me that there is a phenomenon that that science diplomacy arises, however, from a very particular context, and that context began actually changing before our very eyes. So as I suggested, what I want to talk about now is a huge opportunity or a huge body of research and practice that science diplomacy is missing. And that, I mean, I don't want to say this too harshly, science diplomacy is very much a bottom-up thing. The people who talk about it and write about it, it's a club of people who come together and go, oh, we do the same kinds of things. And it's just sort of never finding its human. So I would have preferred to spend the next 15 minutes talking about the next couple of 3 slides. So I'm going to move through this very quickly, just to give you a sampling of what I'm talking about. So first, at the level of practice, particularly in high-income countries, governments have been experimenting with ways to bring science and scientific research to bear on not just policy, but programming for 20, 30, depending on the country, 35 years or longer. So on the right hand of the slide, I have a set of logos from Canada, from the UK, from the US. Some of them things created by government, some of them created by scientists, where we try and systematically bring science to bear. And because these are scientists, we actually have randomized control trials and a small bucket of systematic reviews trying to answer the question, what works? What are the optimal ways of linking science and scientific research to public policy? At a more theoretical realm, since I've been sort of lurking around in this space, there's been an explosion in the amount of research about evidence and policy. There are now specialized journals, any number of public policy journals are routinely run articles on various aspects, some of which, and sometimes we do what we call science diplomacy. So let me talk a little bit about this concept of government. The level of practice, again, we have an explosion of experiments happening on the ground. Some of them are quite old. So at the bottom left, right of the slide, I have the famous SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Committee to the UK government, which made headlines during the COVID-19 pandemic. But this was a pre-existing institution or arrangement that goes back many years. More recently, we've seen the rise of science, not just science advisors in some governments, but an association of science advisors. But Jean-François Doulet and I were talking the other day, and he made a very valid point. The way this looks varies not just by country, but also potentially varies by, if you will, the culture of public administration, or maybe even the views of the role of the state. So in Canada, in the United States, pandemic advice was largely channeled in-house through the CDC in the US, through Public Health Agency in Canada. But in Germany, for example, that function, there is no public health institute as we would know it in Germany. The Robert Koch Institute played sort of that role. Same thing, kind of thing happens in Australia. And Jean-François can explain to us whether the Pascal Institute is like that or different. The broader point is how governments organize themselves to bring science to bear at a very practical level varies. And this too can be studied. So, I'm a longtime member of something called the Global Strategy Lab, which is a research lab that began here at the University of Ottawa, is now co-located at York, University of Ottawa. And for the last decade, we've been doing research on institutional design for global health. So for example, 7 or 8 years ago, we did a series of paper on how to design an international scientific advisory committee. Most of my work for the last decade has been on chief medical officers of health, who are, if you will, the public health version of a science advisor, although that's only touches the surface. The point being, there is a big practice and big literature on how one would organize oneself to bring science to bear pulsively. And to repeat myself perhaps, this literature is not much discussed or even referred to in what we talk about in science diplomacy. But also, it is a truism, public health is political, science is political, but we actually now have, in this case, book-length attempts to think systematically about not just the mechanics of the of science and policy governance, but also the politics of it. Because, and we don't have, I don't have to do this now, but there is political scientists who are interested in this, the extent to which this process is itself politicized. But I want to skip ahead and I want to move to the bad. I describe a world in which science diplomacy has its roots in a rules-based international order that gets created post-World War II. It dramatically expands at the end of the Cold War, and global health governance is a wonderful example of that. And I think it's fundamentally challenged by two things. First, the scientific evidence is now not just contested, it's not just political, but it is a partisan issue. And here I'm drawing the distinction between something that is broadly political and something that has become partisan. And two, and a manifestation of that we're seeing in the United States as we speak. But second, the Trump vision of the world is a fundamental challenge to the rules-based order that we've known. And each of these, in different ways and different combinations, seems to be pose a challenge to the way we think about science diplomacy. So it's not just that science is politicized, it's that scientific evidence has become partisan divide. This had existed, but became very clear during the COVID-19 pandemic. And when the Americans will talk about it, that scientific research used to be one of those things for which there was a bipartisan consensus. Well, those days are gone. And so, I mean, I won't say much about RFK Jr. beyond to say it's caused me and people who work in my area a lot of sleepless nights. But I will draw your attention to the quote, a recent paper on populism in science, where they demonstrate using a survey that it's not just that populist parties, they have a variable relationship with or view of science and scientific research, but it is that they give voice to a very loud minority. So it's not that Canadians or Americans or citizens in high-income countries all of a sudden decided they didn't like science and what science brings. It's that our politics have magnified the voice of a relatively small group of people. And they are pushing political parties. So I put up a slide here. This is Poilievre gave a speech 2 or 3 times last summer, once in French in Montreal, once in English in London, and I think a 3rd time, in which he stakes out a position, as is his right, on how to deal with the opioids crisis. And he makes a promise that his approach will be fundamentally different. I have no issue with that. But he goes on to use, as is his practice, quite dramatic language. But then precedes to mount a frontal attack on people who do research in this field. So I need to talk to OCGS because we need to have a chat. Where do I put academic on my resume? Because according to Mr. Koyev, and we see this in the United States, I've written on harm reduction. I simply am in doing so in service of a political agenda. But this is a very strong example. And I guess my point is to say that it's not just that people disagree on policy or even on the nature of the science. It's that that disagreement has been brought inside government. And if you want, we can talk about examples here in Canada, probably in Alberta. But the broader point I want to make is that the Trump White House has put it in, we're in the middle of a hurricane. We're being bustled and jostled, and each morning we open the newspaper, for those of us who still read newspapers, and dramatic things have been announced. As in a hurricane, you don't know where you're going to land. You don't know what it's going to look like on the other side, but you're reasonably confident it will be different. But what I'm struck by is, and this is almost very confusing. If I read folks in science or in public health or on health research, they're freaking out, especially in the United States. But it's probably not, it's worse than they think. In other words, when I read and follow thinking and analysis from people in political science, yet policy, constitutional law, and international relations, the pictures that these people paint are dramatically more somber. And so it seems to me that both domestically and globally, something is fundamentally changing. And I'm going to be the pessimist. And I think that many of the fundamentals that underpin the practice of science policy are being challenged and might actually be killed. So what do I mean? Well, it's not just an attack on science, although it's that. It's not just a challenge to the rules-based international order. It's that, at least in the short term, discussing these things is crowding everything out. Americans, people who watch the United States, are deeply concerned about where the US government is going. And at minimum, our agenda will be dominated by that. International relations over the next little while is going to be dramatically focused on making sense of and figuring out how to respond to a US government which is challenging some fundamental assumptions. And in science, this matters. As a percentage, the US government investment in basic science is A, enormous, but B, is as a percentage of all investments by high-income countries, is a big number. So to the extent that the supply of science and scientific research to animate science diplomacy, it can no longer be assumed. That's to say, it's being challenged. But what's more is I don't think that it's going to be easy for governments in Canada and elsewhere to fill the gap, because we're going to be too busy figuring out how to take scarce dollars and allocate them to transition to a different economy, develop new trading relationships, investing in defense. So it seems to me that the punchline is that what we're looking at is a dramatically different global agenda where the demand for scientific research will be at best different, at worst will fall dramatically. In the immediate, all those people working on, pick your example, biodiversity treaties, plastics pollution treaties, or in my case, my colleagues and I have been working for a decade on trying to imagine a regime to govern the spread of antimicrobial resistance, superbugs. Antimicrobial resistance is a collective action problem. We need a global collective action response. We spent a lot of time thinking about it, but it's like we knock and like there's no one home. In the short term, it's not high in anyone's priority. So this is going to make it really hard. But it also means, and this is the scarier part, as I was suggesting, that there's a much weaker supply of science. At least in the United States, but potentially also in Canada. My crystal ball is not any better than anyone else's, but will the government of Canada be able to respond to demands to increase its investments in basic science? Maybe, but I suggest that they have a bunch of other priorities that they have to focus on. I think I have some time, so I'll spend a little time on this slide. The other thing that's important is that this change is not the same across the board. The headline is US government cuts science. US government takes a meat cleaver to funding and cuts funding. In public administration terms, the United States government is doing what all the research in public administration says you're exactly not supposed to do. So it'd be useful for teaching purposes. But a closer look, somebody did a quick analysis. They took all the funding cuts that have been announced by the White House. They took an existing survey of insiders, experts, who had already ranked different science agencies and regulators as being more left, more right. And the conclusion is that the cutting is more, as the quote says here, on those parts of the government activity that regulate industry, that protect public health, expand access to education, that have to do with the environment. But what we're not, so for the moment anyway, no one is talking about doing away with DARPA, right? So it's not that, yes, they're taking a meat cleaver, but only to some parts of the government, which is again, a good news, bad news story. It suggests that even the Trump White House thinks that there may be a need for scientific research, but only in a limited number of areas. This may give us some hints as to what the future might look like. So I depressed myself completely while preparing for this talk, and I promised myself, well, let's end on an optimistic note. And this is the best I can do. So this will come to an end. Mark McKee and Ken Hughes, two very senior scholars in global health governance, wrote a piece early on, like this was January, in the British Medical Journal, when they talked about the future of global health governance under a Trump administration. And the theme was hope for the best, prepare for the worst. And the sort of end of it was, well, they'll be gone before. So for the first time in my life, and the British Medical Journal is this odd scientific journal. For those of you not in medicine, medicine journals like the BMJ are both newsletter for the medical profession and research journals. So they allow for letters to the editor. So I wrote a letter to the editor and I said, you're very, very pressing analysis, but you're not nearly pessimistic enough. And that was January, and I think I was being right. In other words, it's not going to end necessarily with Donald Trump. It may not be, the problem may be bigger, deeper than Donald Trump at the White House. But more than that, the forces that yield what we see are much deeper. So Professor Gheciu and my colleagues, several of my colleagues here in the Graduate School of Public and National Affairs, published a book last year, World of the Right, the Radical Conservatives and the Global Order. And the essential argument of that book is that what we're seeing play itself out in the United States is the product of a much deeper, loosely coordinated effort by very conservative actors to fund, promote, encourage a particular brand of conservative parties. This isn't the Conservative Party that we've known for most of the 20th century. They have the category of the radical way. And so this phenomenon, this trend is bigger, deeper beyond a Trump White House. So it suggests that even if Trump leaves, But more than that, there's a disconnect, as I suggested. Political scientists are talking about crisis in ways that are. The second piece of good news, and again, it echoes the point that I made earlier, that while survey research suggests that support for science is strong, this is the piece I was thinking of earlier. A small minority may affect considerations of scientific evidence and policy making. That a very small number of people make a very loud noise. So, if I'm going to be optimistic, I would end with first, that some of the big problems aren't going away, climate change, pandemic risk, the risk of superbugs, they remain, and we have to do the research to keep up with it. So H5N1, bird flu being one of those examples. The other thing is in political science, we talk about the shift from government to governance. And among other things, that's to denote that in international relations in particular, a big role now for NGOs and non-government organizations, including foundations. So in my world of global health, the Gates Foundation, hugely important, second or third largest funder of the World Health Organization, but also at a somewhat lower level, the Bloomberg Foundation, the Wellcome Trust in the UK, big funders and shapers of global health governance in their own right. But also, as high-income countries figure out what the new world order is going to look like, there are going to be new relationships that are tied. And so there were these pictures last summer. The Chancellor comes to Canada. We get pictures of, trying to explain to us that how, hydrogen exports from Canada are around the corner. Well, no, but it is symbolic of sort of the need to develop new relationships. We'll see. So if I had to summarize I'm from political science, I'm here to help. I have some good news, which is the theory and practice of science diplomacy can become much more sophisticated by drawing on an enormous amount of research. The bad news is, it may be that the golden age of science diplomacy, just like what some call the golden age of global health governance, may be, if not coming to an end, the fundamentals are going to be radically different. So with that, I will.
We appreciate that you also gave us some reasons to hope in start of session. So on that note, I will invite Jean-François Doulet to give a response.
Thank you very much. Very interesting indeed. That you put on my glasses to be more intelligent. Yes, it's funny because your level of pessimism allows you to be considered as a very French person, actually, and the French person not to be very pessimistic, but you managed to balance your analysis. So no, it was very, very interesting. Before I go into my remarks, I would like just to make a very short introduction to the concept of the chair. When I say we, University of Ottawa, the French Embassy in Canada, launched in 2023, so about 2 years ago. Just to remind all of us that this chair is above all a concept and above all an experiment. And what are we experimenting? We're experimenting a form of a dialogue on a very, as you explained very well, a very rough topic, a very difficult topic, and a very evolving topic. So here, us today, I guess, is also part of this experimental form of dialogue between two countries, between two academic worlds, between two political cultures, and you added some elements on this on the comparative political approaches to science diplomacy. So two sets of remarks. Reason for being pessimistic and reasons for being optimistic, to follow the main structure of the presentation. So 3 remarks each time. So reasons for being pessimistic: crisis, different form of crisis, we hear a lot about this term polycrisis, in a world upset by a multiple forms of crisis. And when it comes to the relation between politics or policy and science, the first issue we face, it could be indeed the upset balance of power between science and policy, with the idea that before might have been, we might like experience a more balanced exchange of energy between those two worlds, science and policy. Some people may think that since the pandemics is very upsetting episode in our recent history, some may say that since then we are experiencing a kind of a mistrust in science. So mistrust in science could be something that we need to look at very precisely. The second thing is that we may see the emergence of competing narratives when it comes to the relations of our societies to science and technology. And to make it very in a very simplistic form, there are two worlds, two narratives. So the first one is around lab sciences, so environment, biology, health, and you're coming from this world. And so there is a narrative that says science is here to protect us. Science is here to preserve what we have. Science is here to help us protect our environment, our biodiversity. So this is one narrative. And the other narrative that is gaining more momentum is a very much more futuristic type of narratives coming more from the engineering or physics fields of research, where in which in this narrative the idea that technologies are enabling us and new technologies, emerging technologies are going to help us create something else. So it's not the idea of protection, the idea of becoming something else. And here, of course, I make a direct reference to what could be described as Elon Musk's vision of our world somewhere else, somewhere in space. So two competing narratives, and also behind two competing visions of what are the priorities when it comes to funding science. And I won't go back to what you said earlier about chance politics when it comes to cutting funding for some specific agencies. And most of those agencies are more related to life sciences, health, environment, and so forth. Third remarks, and it's another challenge. I think in our globalized world, actually, our political systems are indeed, in fact, very heterogeneous when it comes to integrate science in policy making. There is no one way, there is no one method, there are different ways, different methods. And here we come to the idea of relativity, of comparisons, of complexity. So indeed, it might be more complex to come to a common ground, a common understanding when it comes to building an evidence-based policymaking architecture or method or vademecum, etc. So these are the remarks for remaining or becoming more pessimistic. But indeed, you said that we science diplomacy as we know it, has died or has vanished, and a new form of science diplomacy is emerging. But it's not a negative thing. I think there is many things positive in this new era of science diplomacy, and the proof is that during the last few weeks we had two wonderful reports. One from the European Commission, a European Framework for Science Diplomacy, and the new report from IISS, Science Diplomacy in an Era of Disruption. If science diplomacy was such a bad idea to consider, there wouldn't be so many publications and so many people taking time to think about it. So I think I'm pretty optimistic about the fact that science diplomacy is a fantastic and so interesting field of study. So reason for being optimistic. The first one is coming out of the European Commission report, the idea of the concept of diplomacy in science. So the European Commission added to the three categories coined by the IISS in its first 2010 report, science for diplomacy, diplomacy for science, and science in diplomacy. And the European Commission is adding diplomacy in science. It makes a huge difference. And what it does, it highlights the growing number of players in the ground field. Not the states, not international organizations, but universities, science academies, any type of science-based associations. So actually the number of players is growing. And this is very good. It means that scientists or science-related people, science-related professionals are considering that science is more and more political, or should be more and more political in a good sense. It should be put under the table when it comes to political dialogue. The second good news is that we still have multilateralism. So multilateralism is still the right way to combine efforts to support evidence-based policymaking. And this doesn't stop. On the contrary, the number of multilateral organizations targeting science-related topics is exploding. The proof is, if I want to take one specific example, AI, artificial intelligence. A few weeks ago in Paris, we organized 1 week on artificial intelligence, and we managed to highlight, to uncover the vast complexity of the emerging global governance on AI. It means that there are more and more organizations, more and more alliances, more and more groups taking part in this AI global governance. What is true for AI is true for ocean-related issues, for instance. And we'll see next June during the UN conference on the ocean, the third one, in Nice, in France, also that more international multilateral organizations will rise in favor of the protection of the oceans. And the last thing, the last remark that bring to me a more optimistic feeling is the fact that science is science diplomacy is, and science diplomacy should be more and more a key element of public debate. So science diplomacy should be something that we all need to put on the table, and that should be an object of public, like this one, public gatherings, conferences, seminars, discussions online, in the classroom, in the media. So science diplomacy is a public thing. Science diplomacy is something that is relevant to all of us, and science diplomacy should speak to any one of us as citizens of the world. I support.
Very important remark. Thank you for highlighting both the positive and the negative, you have both given us so much food for thought. We only have about 10 minutes for questions and discussions. So I will invite you, if you do have questions and comments, I will invite you to please raise them, raise your hand, and I will invite you, and I will simply ask you to identify yourself, or also for the benefit of those who are watching online and may not see the names. And maybe just to get you started with a couple of invitations really for further reflection based on your presentation. But it's really so much, so I will try to highlight a couple of points and maybe if we have time, we can come back for more. And the first one would be, and I think, going back Patrick, to your point about this hurricane that we seem to be witnessing with in particular Donald Trump, but a variety of other agents also clearly and explicitly challenging the rules-based international framework. And in this context, I think it's obvious that we need to rethink not simply the role and the rights of science diplomacy, but more broadly, the relationship between state, science, and civil society. And in this context, and in the middle of this hurricane, and I will invite both of you to, where do we look for guidance? And to what extent Canada and the EU could and should cooperate a little bit more closely, understanding on the one hand that they both attach importance to this, and at the same time that, as you both highlighted, that if we think about science diplomacy, it is clearly embedded into a cultural context. So cultural science diplomacy may mean one thing or several things in Canada, but not necessarily the same in France or the European Union. So how do we overcome this diversity of culturally embedded perspectives and set of practices to advance cooperation at a time when, given the role played by the US, arguably cooperation between Canada and the EU is more important than ever. So that would be the broader, perhaps more philosophical, but also practical question. And the second question would be, again, in the new context, what would it take to train the new generation of experts who can engage effectively in science diplomacy? Where do we even start? And what kind of roles would you see for this university, potentially for the research chair, for networks between France and Canada, between the EU and Canada, and perhaps beyond? I mean, we focus more on the Canada relationship for obvious reasons, but there may be an argument for saying we need a much broader set of partnerships, both including non-state actors, as you highlighted in the you see a variety of players becoming interested and involved in this field. So perhaps private actors, non-state actors should play a greater role, and perhaps we should go beyond, geographically beyond the Canada EU territory and incorporate players, perhaps less known in terms of this cooperation, but increasingly important. So perhaps I would invite you, if you wish.
I'll be very quick. Comme dirait ma mère, Tommy, pêche la planche. You put a lot on the table very quickly. To the first, we should pick up on something that Jean-François said a few days ago. The truism is that whereas the United States, the UK, and France have a formal policy of science diplomacy, Canada doesn't. We don't use that concept. Pardon?
Like said that?
Or the way we think about science diplomacy in different. But I think it's deeper than this. I think that the thing that we need to understand is we may be using the same words, but are we talking about the same thing? This reflects, and this, from a political scientist perspective, and allow me to be a public administration, public management nerd, this reflects assumption of the role of the state, how state interacts with civil society, about whether you do things intramurally or extramurally. When you look around the world in different countries, you have different mechanisms. But they're not just like, it's not like a menu and you pick one. They reflect underlying assumptions about what you think government is and how government should operate. And to the extent that we can figure that out, I think, it's not quite a dialogue with that, but I think we're kind of missing something in translation. On the sort of the training piece, it's a good news, bad news story. We're doing way more than we used to. But I teach in the Faculty of Medicine, course in public health governance. My students all have undergraduate degrees in biomedicine of various flavors. And it is enormously difficult to get them to grasp the possibility that policymaking is something other than scientific problem solving. they cling to evidence-based decision making because they can't imagine something else. It's just, it's not even epistemologically, not even. So from a training perspective, we do a bunch of things in Canada that are quite good, but the more we can do to make the next generation of scientists much more literate in governance would be a good thing. So I'll end on this point. The University of Ottawa created its master's degree in public health very recently compared to other universities. And we went out of our way to make governance and policy a core part of the curriculum. My goal is that the students who graduate, when they go to work for the government of Canada, know what the Tourist Report is. Right? We'll find out whether they're having any success. Because the way we train people in science now is government is either invisible or it's like, oh, that thing that gets in the way of bringing evidence to bear. And that has to change.
Yes, I want to add something on training and the role of universities in the new landscape. Just to remind all of us that on next April 22nd and 23rd here in Ottawa, will be host the U7+ Summit. So an association of world universities from the G7 countries, but beyond also the G7 countries. And this is an important milestone with the creation 2 years ago of this alliance. If universities define themselves as key players in the field of science diplomacy, they get the ability to influence policy making, they get the ability to put away their own weight into decision making processes, and also they give themselves the ability to train the next generation, as I said, of science diplomats that we should all become. So in France, we are currently putting a lot of attention on training. In our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we have an internal academy, and this academy is currently designing a curriculum on science diplomacy to train former agents before they are sent to their different postings worldwide. So we need to train diplomats to science and to science, and we need to train scientists to diplomacy or to political science. So it's a cross, a kind of a cross training process that we should work on. And I think the chair could be, I mean, training, designing curriculum could be an outcome of the chair the month or years to come.
Merci beaucoup. Okay, we have a question there. Thank you.
Hi, John Burnett from the National Research Council. Thank you both for a presentation. I know on the slides you had fantastic photos of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the Gulf of America. I just want to ask, in a world where there is an agreement on facts or there's a proliferation of junk science, etc., is a world of science diplomacy even possible when there isn't an agreement on facts or evidence necessarily before you can even get to issues of causation, effect, and solutions? Just welcome your thoughts on that, or how this current era may be different from previous ones.
I spent the last decade teaching myself, 15 years teaching myself public health. I got good at it. I'm cross-appointed to the Faculty of Medicine. And I must say that the public health community is bouleversé in a way that I can't describe. RFK Jr. as the Secretary of Health and Human Services was on nobody's bingo side. I would challenge, though, it's never been a dichotomy between, you know, do we agree on the facts? I think the broader body of research in science, theology studies, philosophy, and science sort of doesn't really go there. It's always been contested. I think what's different, and this is what I tried to convey, what's different now is the critics, skeptics, challengers of what was understood to be the science are now running the government, right? Whether this is RFK Jr. in the United States, the government of Danielle Smith in Alberta releases a report that is full of stuff that just has no basis in the scientific research. Those kinds of ideas are out there. What's different is they're not coming from our government. And I think we need to give our energy. But you're right, ultimately, and this is why I'm a bit of a pessimist, I'm trying to imagine a meeting in which, say, an international meeting in which one of the players doesn't win. If the president of the United States thinks climate change is a hoax, where are we? I think part of the answer is they just don't go. I think what we're gonna see is a fragmentation of debate. And so some governments just won't be part of the conversation. A few days ago, it was announced that the American government was cutting its funding for one of the themes of work for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's like, we're just gonna take our marbles and go home. So in that sense, the problem you need never appears.
In French, we have an expression, la fabrique du crétin, the fabric of the idiot. So I think this is what at risk. What at risk is the disconnection between science and the general public. Because science will always be worked on and discussed in the spheres of those who know. So the only way to go around this risk is to invest in schools, education. And once you become an enlightened individual, enlightened citizen, then no risk, you can believe whatever private information you get online. So yeah, so it's a long-term process, but it's always a matter of education. I think we go back to the training idea concept we discussed earlier. Yeah, it is the point, I think, being sure that all of us are fully using their brain capacity.
Thank you. We'll have time for one more question, so we'll go to.
Can I get it? Thank you. Merci beaucoup pour vos commentaires. Je vais vous faire réfléchir. I want to focus on the diplomacy part of the conversation today, and I'm gonna take a shortcut, which I will admit might not, survive a critical test, but bear with me. Canada's always been a middle power, right? Or at least was for a long time a middle power, right? When I was studying at the university across town in international relations, it was like, that's what Canada does, right? We're not the US, we're not, and this is the shortcut, which may not survive. Can we make a parallel between Canada's investment in national defense, NATO, as a percentage of GDP, and our potential influence in science diplomacy? Because this is the way I see it. Right now, if you want to be respected by certain players, it's like, show me how many toys you're actually willing to put in a sandbox, right? In this case, unfortunately, the toys are tanks and fighter planes, but you get the picture. Canada view crochet of other people's science endeavors. A lot of Canadian researchers and institutions survive only thanks to the NIH, the NSF, the Department of Energy, and so on. I'm in the science funding field. There's a lot of science in Canada that will not happen if the Department of Energy in the United States, particularly its Office of Science, didn't put money into it. So we've basically been living off everybody's generosity for years, and suddenly we expect that, as you said, it's an alarming thought, but if there's less US investment, which is the largest investor in science, bar none, the Chinese are second by a big margin. If the US isn't going to support it, we don't have the capacity to put our money into it. Like, what's left of Canadian science? So for me, I see diplomacy as, Canadians keep doing this. Our research funding agencies keep doing this. We go across to another country, we come back with an MOU, and then the other partner says, well, great, where's your $1 million?
well, so like, how credible can we be as a science diplomacy actor? If we're actually not willing to put the wherewithal, i.e. money behind it, along with to get to the bottom line.
Patrick, you have about 1 minute.
I'll take a minute and a half. There are others in the room who probably have the numbers at their fingertips as to the relative importance of US funding for Canadian science. But you're right, I mean, we do rely on it. I guess, if your premise is correct, then the problem is going to get worse before it gets better, because the competition for the budgets of the government of Canada is going to be ferocious. But let me end on a positive note. As I alluded to at the outset, I spent a lot of years in government, and while my last role was with the government of Canada in the Privy Council office, I spent 5 years working for the government of Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan is described as one of those small governments that plays or pumps above its weight. That is to say, it is disproportionate. And I think what Canada brings is we have a very strong public service. We have a very strong diplomatic corps. As much as we criticize it internally, we know how the game is played. And so I think even if we bring fewer resources, our ability to leverage and maximize those resources should not be underestimated, number one. But number two, even though it's sometimes less and less credible, we like to be liked. So we are incessantly trying to build alliances in Europe, in Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia. Our credibility is sometimes is questioned, but we're really good at that network. And I think that just part of our DNA. And so that has to be an asset.
Well, on that encouraging note, I'm afraid we have to bring this Q&A session to an end. Thank you so much for the question and comment. Apologies to those who did not get a chance to ask questions, but do not worry, the conversation will continue, and I encourage you to get in touch with us because I'm sure they would be happy to continue the conversation. For my part, thank you once again so much, Mr. Patrick Fafard, Dr. Jean-François Doulet. I really appreciated your comments. We learned a lot from you. Thank you so much, Monica, for your leadership. Thanks to your team for all the hard work. Thanks to Professor Martin Lagate, of course. Thanks to all of you for being here, for the comments, for the attention. And with this, I will give the floor back to Monica. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Alexander. I think that you said it all. This has been absolutely tremendous, and we thank all of you for attending, and look forward to discussions to come. Definitely not the last word on these complex and contentious issues. So thank you, and with that, we will close down the online session. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you soon.